Hello, everyone. I'll give you a second to get connected to sound. Hello, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rails 1286 New Social Environment. I'm Magali, a programs associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Alex Strada and Gaby Collins-Fernandez. And now I'll introduce today's guest and host. Alex Strada is a New York City-based artist and educator working across installation, still and moving image, sound, performance, and public practice. Through research-driven, collaborative projects, she reimagines systems of power and creates platforms for collectivity and civic transformation. Since 2022, she has served as public artist in residence with New York City's Department of Homeless Services and Department of Cultural Affairs. Recent solo exhibitions and commissions include the Storefront for Art and Architecture, Queens Museum, Yerba Buena Center for the Arts, Aldrich Contemporary Art Museum, Project Row Houses, and Times Square Arts. She's currently the Fine Arts Civic Engagement Fellow at the Pratt Institute. And our host today, Gaby Collins-Fernandez, is an artist living and working in New York City. Her work has been shown in the US and internationally, including at Peter Freeman Inc., the Birmingham Museum of Art, and El Museo del Barrio, and has been discussed in publications such as the Brooklyn Rail and Art Critical. She's a founder and publisher of the annual magazine Precog and a co-director of the artist-run art and music initiative Bomb Pop-Up. And with that, I will hand it over to Gabby to get us started.
Um, Hi everyone, and it's really a pleasure to get to be talking with Alex about New York City today, in particular, and especially about how public art, public address, and a sense of both aesthetics and politics as structure, form, and content is something that we can think about both as people who love and think about art, and also people who love and think about the places that we live in. So Public Address is the name of it's an exhibition currently up and project at around Manhattan, but the main installation of Public Address is at Petrosino Park. And it also includes a component of, I think, 12 other locations across different districts in Manhattan, and it's a project which I'll let you talk about specifically, but it's a project that it's the culmination project of your um, role as artist in residence for the New York City Department of Transportation and also of Homeless Services. So there's
Just
quite a
of
lot,
homeless services, not of transportation.
not of transportation, just
Oh,
of Homeless Services. Okay, cool. Um, And so there's quite a lot that goes into your work as process, as research, as advocacy, um, and and then also in the configuration of objects and interactions with the greater public. So it's really a show where the things that we're looking at visually become sort of icons that open up into experiences of fellow New Yorkers, as well as other ways of thinking about the structure of public art at large. So I'm wondering if you could talk to us about public address and about your experience working with the city to develop this project.
yes, of course. Thank you so much, Gabby. Really excited to be in conversation with you, especially today. Um, but Public Address is a project that, like you said, emerges out of the years that I've been embedded in city government in this ongoing role of public artists in residence within the Department of Homeless Services and the Department of Cultural Affairs. So the idea behind this residency is that the city will embed artists in different agencies. You're given an ID card, a cubicle, and access, but it's really up to that artist to decide what it is to make of the experience itself. The residencies don't necessarily have a timeline or expiration date embedded within them. It's kind of modeled after Muriel Latterman Ukeleze's lifelong self-appointed residency with the Department of Sanitation. But for me, I've been with the Department of Homeless Services, which I might use the acronym DHS at various moments in this conversation. And I want to also name now that Department of Homeless Services has nothing to do with Department of Homeland Security. But I've been embedded in the Department of Homeless Services for 3 years. And before that experience, I had taught art in shelters for many years. I've also lived in New York my whole life. But I never had, by any means, the kind of access that the residency affords. And the expectation or the idea is that the artist will produce some kind of public facing project. And I went into this role really just wanting to talk to as many people as I possibly could. And if you think back to 2022, this was the time when people started being shipped to New York on buses by like Governor Greg Abbott of Texas, where we had a really large increase in people seeking asylum in the United States and coming to New York. And it was politically also a very different moment. If you can also think back to that time, Eric Adams, in a kind of political move, was like, yes, please bring as many people as you can. And then had backtracked that and tried to also, challenge the right to shelter law. That's such an important bedrock to homeless services. But anyway, I spent this first year of the residency really just wanting to listen to as many people as I could, visit as many shelters as I could. And it's from that like prolonged period of um, listening and engagement that this project Public Address emerges. So inside city shelters, there are logbooks. These are books that usually staff use to write down what they think is most important at the end of a shift. And as an artist, I was really fascinated by these books because they're handwritten forms of record keeping where anyone who is, yes, that's it, where anyone who's working kind of at the end of their shift writes down what they think is important. And the next person coming on shift has to read it and add to it. And I wanted to come up with a structure for a project where that like those really meaningful conversations that I was having wouldn't kind of just end with me in a one-on-one form, but where there could be a kind of structure that enabled um, public address, public engagement. And so borrowing and kind of misusing this official form of record keeping and drawing from my experiences as a teacher, I started holding log writing workshops in shelters around the city, where I essentially invite people to write down what they think is most important. It's a very open-ended kind of prompt, but I essentially take those books, like the ones we were just seeing, cut their spines off and go to different shelters with these pages from these official record keeping texts, give a kind of artist talk, invite people to participate in the work and share whatever they think they might want to correct the record on concerning homelessness, so to speak, because something that I often was hearing was a deep frustration with feeling spoken about or for as someone navigating shelter and not really being listened to directly. So this was an opportunity for people to be able to, while still maintaining anonymity if they would like, um, be able to address the greater New York City public.
I mean, one of the things which is so notable in your work is the way that you use the format of the institution and then switch up the content, right? So the idea that, I mean, in this case, quite literally, right, using the form of the logbook to then shift our understanding of who determines importance, what kind of story is being told. And how it's displayed, but in a way that also proposes that that kind of reflection ought actually to be a part of the institutional conception um, of what we consider. And I know that throughout your project, your use of institutional formats is also really intentional in particular, from the logbook to the production of the signs themselves. So I'm wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about how you landed on the idea of signage and correlating the books, which are kind of a more private, even if it's in an institutional format, would have been read um, like by the department, it would not have been made public in the same way, and how you connected that to ideas of signage and this kind of more ubiquitous public communication around directions.
Yes. I think, taking that directive of that frustration of feeling like spoken about or for and not listened to, I wanted to think like, what is a way in which to intervene in city infrastructure in some form and kind of borrow the authority of city devices in order to center these different narratives, responses. Like many of them are drawings, as you can see. Um, and that is what led me to wanting to try to get the Department of Transportation on board. I actually like that you made the slippage of saying that I was in residence with them. I do feel like I really embedded myself. This is a picture of the Department of Transportation sign shop. This is the sign shop in Maspeth, Queens, where all of our city signs are made and often printed by hand using screen prints and printed by like master printers who are all unionized working for the city. I often tell my students or even our students in some cases, Gabby, that like you have a unionized professional printmaking job with the city if you want to pursue it.
Mm,
And essentially, I was able to create this collaboration with the Department of Transportation where they agreed to use upcycled city street signs and instead of printing different kinds of like authoritative directives that have, quite literal legal implications. Like if you park your car somewhere where it says towaway zone, your car can get towed. How to borrow that same authority and reroute that same kind of power, but to center different narratives, ideas, moments of advocacy, moments of personal reflection by people experiencing homelessness, and kind of misuse city signage in that way. This is a picture of a kind of outcropping that I actually, one of the printers took this photo and texted it to me because he said that everyone in the shop who wasn't working on the project was just like, what is this? What are you guys working on? Because they don't actually normally ever print custom shapes like this. So it was also
mm.
kind of stretching the material capacities of the city sign shop as well.
I mean, one thing, that comes up, I think, even in considering like the formats that you're using in the project is that like it not only the installation of Petrosina Square and the way that you're talking about process not only tells the story, the literal stories that are being foregrounded there, which is also like really impactful. And I know we'll get a chance to sort of talk about what that feels like and looks like in a little bit. Um, but in using these other forms that we recognize from other kinds of institutional like aesthetics, basically different kinds of institutional aesthetics, it also calls into question sort of some larger thematics that have to do with how we consider homelessness in general, right? So like the idea of thinking about transportation directives and how the signs mark places of legality and illegality in the city around how we move, how we pause, like how we stop, who's allowed to be where at what time. Um, and also, like similarly for something like the logbook or the idea of record keeping. It's a really interesting, I think it's a way of thinking about how things that we might normally address as quote unquote problems that we need to like fix or address in some way in the city, right? Which is like, we have a crisis of X, are actually quite embedded into our understanding of how the city like has its like normative movements or something like this, like how we consider like what movement is, how people access that kind of movement, and of course, like where and how we're allowed to stay somewhere, like in a home, in a house, like in the subway, on the street, etc.
Absolutely. And in the time that I have been in residence with the Department of Homeless Services, homelessness also became criminalized by the Supreme Court.
Hmm.
So there in 2024 was a Supreme Court ruling that basically said sleeping outside can be criminalized. And while it's not necessarily enforced in New York City, it could be, and it is being enforced in other places. And we also have extreme increased criminalization of migrants, as you know, everyone knows. And again, when I started my residency, the presence or fear of ICE was not something that people were contending with. And now there are many people who are also afraid to leave shelters because they are fearful of even sending their kids to school because of the possibilities of being taken by ICE, kidnapped by ICE. So I think the something that has also changed so much in the time of working on this project. While today feels like a very hopeful day, there's also been extreme kind of criminalization on the federal level, as well as different policies on the city level that the project kind of contends with.
Mm,
Um, I know we haven't talked much about the material basis of the project, but maybe I'll even just use this
sure.
as a way to focus on them. So the Parks Department requires that every freestanding sculpture in Petrosino Square be a minimum of 800 pounds, which is very heavy. And when I learned that kind of directive that we weren't able to actually kind of adhere into the ground, that there had to be these freestanding bases. I was working with an architect named Ekin Bilal to kind of come up with a system that would be responsive to those conditions, and most importantly for me, think through the possibilities of what a base could be and how it could function in other ways. So there's a number
Mm,
of these bases actually double as seating. And then embedded throughout the park are different footrests, which I have to say are like by far the most popular part of this installation. Like whenever you're in Petrosino Square, whether or not someone's engaging with the project, their feet is up, are their feet up on a footrest, like as you see here. And these are really kind of subtle, quiet gestures, but gestures nonetheless that are meant to kind of challenge the hostile architecture inherent to the park itself. Like we even
mhm,
see this person here, couldn't splay out on the bench because of the armrest that's intentionally placed there. But the footrest is there to try and kind of like gently counter that and create a space of rest and reflection
mm,
in a city that is, increasingly privatized, or we also have fewer and fewer public spaces to begin with, let alone public sites of rest.
mm,
Um, I think the other thing that the this insistence on public rest and really also ties to um, the fact that we have a right to shelter, which is an incredible like part of this work, and really what motivated me to want to work within the Department of Homeless Services to begin with.
mm,
Maybe everyone on this call already knows, but in case you don't, New York City is the only city in the United States that legally guarantees a bed to anyone who needs it, regardless of immigration status. So the city has to like legally fulfill that mandate that by like if someone is asking for shelter by 10 o'clock at night, the city has to give it to them. Otherwise, the city can be sued. And there's actually an internal watchdog organization called the Coalition for the Homeless that the project's first public program involved kind of hearing from the director of advocacy there, that really creates this system of accountability where we have um, we have more people, many more people who are sheltered than are unsheltered. So about 95% of people experiencing homelessness are people that you wouldn't necessarily be able to identify as experiencing homelessness. And a really important part of this project is to also kind of move away from like harmful or reductive stereotypes around homelessness, and to also kind of assert and educate about that right to shelter.
mm. I mean, the idea of like shelter is something which is a right is first of all like amazing, something to consider in terms of the city, but also kind of reiterates these questions about like why when we're talking, this idea of talking about, talking for, talking with people, right? Um, like maintaining a relationship to the structure of legality in your work seems like it's such an important feature. As well as like how like to create visibility about both like the realities of a specific population, but also like the logistical like bureaucracy of what it means for this population to interact with city infrastructure.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, my hope always is to think about what it means when to engage with the law, but to also like
Mhm.
deeply question it. And having a right to shelter, but not having a right to housing
Right,
can lead to people being stuck in shelter, especially people who are asylum seekers, let's say, who are not eligible for the same kinds of support systems that citizens are. So I think
right.
like trying to point to and think about the importance of this kind of like safety net law, but also in amidst like greater crises of affordability, there's so much more that has to happen for this law to even kind of fulfill the kind of promise that it purports to um, fulfill. And but in bringing up the infrastructure and the bureaucracy, I mean, so much of this work I see as being related to kind of the history of institutional critique,
Mhm,
kind of applying that logic in within public systems and
mhm,
thinking about what it means as an artist that's embedded in a public system, and rather than just kind of creating an artwork that is solely critical of that system and exists like in a place of representation, I'm really interested in how to like go beyond representation to make works that tangibly ask for new
mhm,
different kinds of social relations, new in different kinds of even like legal relationships. So this project requires four different city agencies to work together who don't normally work together to address homelessness. And
mhm,
for example, on the screen, we have a log entry from Alexander. It says, "My name is Alexander. I consider myself the luckiest guy alive because I made NYC my home. As a trans guy, it's hard to be yourself and survive being unhoused. I'm very lucky because I'm in one of the safest shelters. I have a long way to go before I can have I think, a place of my own, and live my truth as the man that I am, but it's promising though."
mhm,
Um, and so like a log entry like that was not only kind of like contributed to this project by Alexander, but then it has to be kind of the Department of Transportation has to then take this and print it and imbue like care and time into centering this work. And then the Parks Department has to agree to have it on view in their space that they are kind of in charge of. And I think that like all of those different layers of negotiation and collaboration and asking these different systems to operate differently, it
mhm,
often involves a lot of deep conversation and
mhm,
negotiation and uh, trust, patience, risk taking on the part of everybody involved. But it's also about chartering new different kinds of pathways for infrastructure to operate in ways and city systems to operate in ways that they are not necessarily used to doing.
I have so there's a some questions about or like a conversation about representation, which again I want to like put a star in because I know that this is like really foundational to how you conceive of what public art can offer in general. But I also wanted to know, just as you're talking about working with these agencies, if like that if this exercise in terms of that collaboration has led to good relationship forming between them. Like, is that something that you've been able to see the fruits of?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I think it has led to really like genuinely meaningful collaboration. When I
Mm,
started with the Department of Homeless Services, again, 2022, something that a number of staff members had shared with me was that there had just been a parade thanking all of the agencies that had been most essential during COVID. I don't know if folks on this call remember it, but it was this like public sector worker day parade. And the Department of Homeless Services was not invited to the parade, let alone like like doing so much work to be able to support people during COVID. And
right.
there's a lot of like deep kind of like pain, frustration, and resentment. And I think that um, homelessness is a concrete representation of many different failed systems.
Hmm.
It's, and I think the only way in which to try and move beyond a city in which there is mass homelessness, the way there is here, is for these agencies to talk to one another and to work together. And that was
Hmm.
something that I saw and felt early on, and I knew it was going to be important to me, whatever the form the project took, that it was not just solely within the world of just the Department of Homeless Services, but had this it reach to like actually ask other agencies to be involved.
Mm.
Um, at one moment in time, the funding for my project was frozen. This was around the same time that all of the, if you can recall, when like libraries had to be closed and there were all of these city budget cuts, I was told by the Department of Homeless Services and the Department of Cultural Affairs, like I was given essentially like a kind of cease work order. And at that point, that they knew me well enough to be like, I know you're not actually going to stop working on this project. And imagine I had been running these log writing workshops, hundreds of people had participated. I had been sharing with people like what you share is going to be printed across New York City. So the thought of also not being able to see the project through was really devastating. And that was when the Storefront for Art and Architecture got involved as a collaborative or a
Mm.
curatorial partner. I reached out to them because I'd recently had a good studio visit with Guillermo, but not really thinking that they would really help realize the project, but they, thinking maybe they'd be a fiscal sponsor to help fill the gap that had emerged. And they've been a really incredible partner. But imagine like there's so many different people involved in the making of this work. There's four city agencies and an arts nonprofit. And in many ways, the project asks all of them to kind of behave outside of the norms that they would normally behave in. Um,
Right.
and yeah, maybe one last thing I'll add, just thinking as we're thinking through and talking about the
Hmm.
infrastructure of this work. I also, knowing that there was, not a big budget, but a budget and a budget to be able to hire people to actually install and deinstall the work as it travels across the city, I was able to create this collaboration with another nonprofit called Common Point that does construction job training for people who usually just got their work permits. And so we're able to kind of hire people who are getting this hands-on experience. A lot of them are like new New Yorkers and are learning about what it means to work with all these different city agencies and getting the same paid experience that um, or getting paid the same amount and having the same experience that Storefront would normally give art handlers. So that's even an
Mm.
example of me kind of asking Storefront to operate in a way that they might not normally operate. But it's been it's been meaningful, I think, all these different systems that have emerged, even though, it's a project that took 3 years to make largely because of the complexities of asking agencies, systems, people to kind of engage and misuse official protocols in different
Mm.
forms.
I mean, it also strikes me, like as you're talking about all of this, that like there's like a they're kind of like not like nominal, sorry, uh nameable, nominal. Anyway, so my brain just like fried for a second. Um, but there are like nameable ideas about what might constitute, and like here in quotes, like the art project, right? Which is like the conversation with folks in terms of making the logbook workshop sessions, and then also the production of these signs, right? But that like the idea of that project is actually kind of like an excuse for a different art project, which is how to get all of these people to work together toward a shared goal, which asks them to use their material resources and their skills in ways that they may not have had permission or the opportunity to do so beforehand. And then on the other side of the production, there's like how it is that because they're public artworks, they're placed there and they're situated in this way that you've talked about, right? Where they become chairs or where they become reminiscent of signs, right? That you have both an engagement with the object in terms of what it depicts and also an engagement with the object as a feature of public space, so that it kind of denies the idea of the spectator as like the end audience of art and rather allows for the works themselves to become um, participants inside of a civic structure that we recognize in particular ways, and then also intervene in other ways around how they communicate their own kind of like subjects. Um, and that just feels like a really, for me, that's a really exciting way of thinking about the way of conceiving artwork in relationship to objects, especially, right? Where the objects feature as um, representations of kinds of systems, right? And like points along the way in a process, but not necessarily, like as representations of people or something like this, or representations of subject matter. Um, so, I mean, that was sort of a lot, for me. I also had a moment in the park, which I visited last week, and it was a gorgeous day and it was delightful. So, I recommend to everyone to both encounter these signs in the world and also go check out the installation of Petrosino. Seeing people with their feet on some of the footstands, like seeing the pigeons kind of like populate in a particular way, like use the signs for their own purposes, the birds. And then also when I was looking at these, thinking about the shapes of signs as a kind of geometric abstraction that we accept to tell us things in the city, and how deviating from that also changes our ideas of what kind of content shapes might mean in the world, right? And like what decoration might mean, like seeing these signs in the park and how, in some of the cases, the drawings hang on either side of the fence, right? So that they become both signage and also this like playful decoration of our public space in a way that's really lovely and meaningful. And then looking at the stands and being reminded of sort of like the utopian brutalist architecture of like many other parts of the world, right? That like these are like the stands remind me of like smaller scale like concretist architecture in like Brazil or something like this. And having all of those things kind of play together is just something that was, I learned a lot, and it was also extremely pleasurable to experience all of this together in the work.
I think I really appreciate you sharing all of that. Like, I think for me, aesthetics are very, very important in order to engage people about with a work that also like requires time in
Mhm,
order to have a multi-layered engagement with. So I think if there weren't drawings or if everything was just a rectangle and if there weren't like there wasn't color if the bases didn't like invite you to sit like it might be hard to get people to actually stay and engage with a subject that is chronically talked about in broad strokes. And this is a work that actually really asks for nuance. It asks you to stay and sit and engage with many different
mhm,
kinds of perspectives that also sometimes conflict with one another. Um, Another important aspect of the project, though, is like to think how there's this long form kind of or like larger scale installation, one in every park that
mhm,
will exist across the five or one in every borough in a park over the next year. But then there also was this conscious effort to have these smaller signs be on view, one for every community district in Manhattan.
mhm,
And there's a map that I think is in the chat if anyone is interested in seeing where those signs are. But a lot of thought also went into what content is on view where.
mhm,
Um, and I do a lot of like mapping research to inform what it means for like works to exist in space in the city. And so in neighborhoods with, there's a lot of inequities in terms of where shelters are placed. So in Community District 2, which is where the main installation is, that is all of Greenwich Village, all of Soho, parts of NoHo, parts of Nolita, and a little bit of the Lower East Side. Um, there is only, I believe, last I checked, this number kind of changed a lot. There's only one shelter versus if you go to neighborhoods in the South Bronx or East Brooklyn, or even if you go to the Lower East Side with like the legacy of redlining, there are many, many more shelters.
Mm,
And like that data actually helped inform what content was on view where and what types of course there's never any kind of monolithic audience, but like thinking about how to invite more people into the conversation in neighborhoods like the one that Petrosino is in, where there's also like a big history of NIMBYism. There's a big
mm,
history of neighborhoods really working to try and stop shelters or affordable housing from being built because housing is linked to property value. And people are afraid that then what they've worked so hard to be able to own, it goes down in value. And that is destabilizing and scary. And uh, the text that I'll read from in a little bit is really about really questioning that really like that very deep inherent relationship of real estate and property value and getting away from discourse really about home,
mhm.
which I think this project is, of course, about asserting the importance of the right to shelter, but really more than anything, it's about housing advocacy because no
Mhm.
one's homeless.
Right. I mean, it also, like it points out, I mean, one of the things about this project, which is also so great, is that like even in an hour, we won't be able to talk about all of the things that you've thought through and like all of the different implications. Which is amazing, right? It's just, I think, a project that, even since having seen it, kind of like blooms in my mind in terms of how like all of these connections exist, in terms of how it creates a sense of like civic responsibility around itself. Um, and in a way which like feels really connected to just the kind of interhuman like relationship of being like, these are fundamentally people. And how is it that you maintain a relationship to lived experience, right? And the lived experience of people who, in relationship to housing, that we might think about as a feature of a shared understanding of what it means to live together, and how we might want to continue to live together. Um, I also know that part of your work, that you're somebody who quite cl evidently and clearly has found a way to work with these systems, like almost as the material. It's almost like the format of the work. Your medium is like using these institutional structures. But you also often work outside of these institutional structures as well. So I know as you were discussing some of the delays and obstacles that your project bumped up against, you also developed a project called Collective Mobilities, which occurred at Pratt, which is how we met. We both work for Pratt. So another institutional shout out here. Um, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that project, but also about how you think about working um, with government or within these kinds of institutional structures, and when you work outside of them, and what that means for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think so. Collective Mobilities was a project that as Gabby said, it was made in the context uh, of the Pratt Institute, but it's a project that kind of continues to live on and iterate in different forms. Essentially, I'm part of a mutual aid group that meets every Saturday that gives out hot food and clothing to anyone who wants it. But really, the group emerged in front of Hall Street, which was once like one of the largest migrant shelters in New York City. It shut down. It's turning into condos, unsurprisingly. Um, but we still continue to meet and have a really beautiful community. And I wanted to be able to come up with a kind of structure where, knowing that I was embedded in an institution like Pratt, a private school that where There are, though, a lot of interested students and wanting to kind of move beyond the limits of the gates of the campus, like how we could come up with a kind of structure that invites them to participate in different models. And so the mutual aid mobiles, those are the sculptures we were just looking at. They're a series of mobile devices that are used to collect and redistribute clothing. And this emphasis on clothing really emerged because the Department of Homeless Services doesn't have enough staff, doesn't have enough capacity to be able to accept lightly used clothing. So in a very small but like immediate way, and knowing that there's such a need for clothes, especially at this moment in time when a lot of people were coming to New York and entering into freezing temperatures and were not well equipped. I wanted to try and create a structure that helps to kind of fulfill some of that need. So working with students, we kind of transformed this gallery space into a collection hub, and working with many faculty as well. Gabby brought your students, you brought Know Your Rights cards. This was like a really beautiful, massive collective effort on campus. And each week we would load the mobiles up with the donations that were given. And I think there's another photo that shows that's an example of some of the donations. And the next photo, I think, shows this process of actually like physically moving them, like traversing sidewalks, bringing them out to the mutual aid site where clothes are usually distributed on cardboard on the ground. It's not so sanitary. It's not always as like dignified as it could be. So this project really emerged to also really equip people with clothes that they need, but also choice. Like there were a lot of people started coming to shop at the gallery looking for clothes for church or for getting married or for someone's birthday. And like I remember someone gave this incredible like sequined dress, but I was like, okay, no one's going to take this. And like an hour after it was dropped off, someone came and was like, this is perfect. This is what I need for my friend's birthday. So like there was this really fulfilling aspect of this project, and that like unlike the difficulty of like moving through official systems, which can take forever, and the kind of rule of social services is if you're supporting one person, you have to be able to support everyone. Mutual aid is very different in the sense that it's ad hoc, it's grassroots. You might not be able to help everyone, but you might be able to really help one person kind of fulfill their needs in that moment in time, and vice versa. You know, the entire idea of mutual aid is world building to try and imagine and work towards other kinds of worlds and networks of support that, you know, beyond governmental social structures.
Yeah, I mean, it's also a way of thinking about what our collective responsibility is in different ways, right? That we have both a responsibility to make structures that serve us, that might take more time to develop, and also a responsibility to like, you know, be flexible about what the immediate needs of our communities might be. I also think it's really interesting because, I mean, as we go through these photos too, you know, like the mobiles feel like they're also riffing on like Memphis design. Like I think the relationship to design and architecture history in your work is also, I think, really interesting in the sense, I mean, for a lot of reasons, but including the idea that there are like specific kinds of hopes or wishes that are embedded in certain kinds of styles and certain types of objects um, that we can like reanimate by using them, right? By literally making them mobile in a certain way and not just, you know, thinking about them as this kind of like static, stylistic option.
Yeah. And I think that goes back to from like the importance of aesthetics, like the importance
Totally.
of that like seduction of color and of in this case like trying to make something that you really want to touch and engage, but also isn't like too childlike, like is kind of inviting for people of all ages. And another important aspect of this work, you know, I mentioned the data, how data always kind of informs and
Hmm.
underlies. I think when you're working through like complicated issues around housing and homelessness,
Hmm.
so kind of lining the walls of the exhibition were these maps that really focused on different entry points into understanding homelessness that were the same colors as the mobiles. So
Mhm.
this is a map that looked at where every 311 call that was made in 2024 came from that was a non-emergency complaint around homelessness. And what these series of maps kind of revealed was that in the neighborhoods with the most around amount of vacant, empty apartments, luxury apartments that can't be rented, are the same neighborhoods that have the least amount of shelters, like
Mm,
Community District 2, which Petrosino Square is in, and are also
mhm,
the neighborhoods with the most amount of complaints around homelessness. Um,
mm,
so these maps also helped, especially like the pedagogical component. This was shown in the context of a school, inviting different students to actually come in and kind of not just learn about like abysmal data that like we don't want to we don't want this to be the world that we live in. So how can then rather than it just kind of like ending here, how do we actually take some kind of action? And the mobile activation was one offering.
yeah, I mean it also, like as we talk about it, I think speaks to how when you put these objects, like putting these objects, the maps, the mobiles, the signs inside of context that we recognize as looking or being a certain way, also like reminds us that those systems are themselves constructed, right? That there's a kind of plasticity to how we make our civic life, that we can use our, ideas about art or aesthetics, or what it means to think in a creative way. It's like it's an invitation to apply these ideas into, like the lives around us and not treat art and public life as though they're distinct from one another.
Absolutely. And I think uh, it I think that's so true. And today especially feels hopeful. I
I
think if
mean,
we had
yeah.
this conversation last week, it would feel more
You're
like
like,
about
what?
reclaiming and rerouting and
Yeah,
like the work of like the undercommons. And I think like
totally.
today is a day where we're also like welcoming in someone who wants to legislate in that kind of way. So
Totally.
I my hope is that even like art and public life feel less and less separate from one another, even with the kind of outpouring and engagement of artists when it comes to supporting a candidate like Zoran.
Yeah. I mean, I think also, yeah, the idea of working for the city, or like the idea of having a bureau, like the idea of the city as a kind of the herald of all these bureaucracies that you're a part of, as opposed to someone who's actively trying to shift things or change things or make a city together, also feels really exciting. I know that we're kind of getting close to the end here. So, and there's, like these projects are just so, I think, interesting and meaningful. I really get a lot out of talking with you about them, and also like learning about them, and taking up their invitation to become more involved in how we make our city, how we make and participate in our city. I'm also wondering if you could sort of at this point, knowing what we know now about these projects, could let us know how you became interested in working in this way. Like what led you into institutional critique, and what led you into wanting to work with the city on homelessness?
Yeah, I mean, I think specifically uh, when it comes, I mean, I'm very much a New Yorker. I've lived here my whole life. I also have people in my immediate family and my extended family who struggle with a lot of the same issues that people navigating city shelters struggle with: mental illness, substance use, um, eviction, housing insecurity, navigating like how difficult it is to even apply for SNAP. And then now we know it's like, potentially not going to continue in the way that people rely on it and the way family members of mine rely on it. So I say all of this because I was really interested specifically in working with the Department of Homeless Services because I wanted to better understand what it means for our, as someone who does have pride for our, complex, flawed city, but as someone who's proud to be here, like I think we should be more proud of the right to shelter and what the right to shelter also offers in terms of a potential promise of a right to housing. And
Hmm.
so I wanted to work within the specific agency because I wanted to better understand what it actually means to fulfill that promise and also its limitations.
Hmm.
And but thinking about your question of institutional critique more broadly speaking, I mean, I think that as someone who is like as a socially engaged artist, as someone who is really invested in thinking about like systems from different vantage points, the more you engage with different institutions, the more you also realize they're just people. And they're just people that are kind of reinforcing different kinds of reproducing different kinds of flows of how things operate. And like you said before, Gabby, they're socially reproduced. And because they're socially constructed, they could operate in other ways. And I think
Right.
that the more we also like demystify this idea of an institution as something that is separate from us or government as something that is separate from us, the more that we can actually reroute and reclaim power in a kind of grassroots way, and also invite these systems, quite literally like pave the way for these systems to operate differently. And there are
Mm.
many artists who came before me that allow me to even be able to think in this kind of way. And that those are many institution critical artists. I'm also very much a kind of student of art history, and I'm interested in how to learn from and borrow from artists like um, Fred Wilson or Martha Rossler, or Muriel Latterman Euclides, of course, and how to kind of think
I
about
know she's amazing.
those lineages, but kind of like build on them in different ways, and also think about the artists and the ways of making that can come from the different pathways that, maybe it took 100 emails to get them to agree to something, but then maybe another artist could do a project with signs that might have seemed off limits before. So I
Mm.
think working within institutions and kind of asking them to operate differently is also about like leaving the door open for people to come with you and similarly demand new and different forms of navigating institutions.
Yeah, that's amazing. I think that's a really lovely place to end the formal part of our conversation. And so I think thank you again, Alex. This has been such a treat. And I think now it's time for the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Gabby and Alex. That was so wonderful. For our audience members, if you have a question for Alex, there is a link in the chat where you can submit your question and we will turn to you next. The first question comes from Nini Humphrey. And Nini says, I have several shelters in my Gowanus neighborhood, one of which is a former Holiday Inn where a bus load of families from Guatemala and living in Texas were dropped off several years ago. Is there an opportunity for artists in this neighborhood to participate in the recording of people's experiences?
Oh, that's such a I mean I would love to talk with you further. So maybe uh what's the best way to I would say
I
like
can connect you. I know
yes,
Nina's a friend. If that's okay with y'all, I can shoot you guys a cross email.
I would say absolutely. I would say like let's be in touch. And I also think that it's really difficult for people who don't have that kind of like governmental ID to be able to enter or have access to a shelter itself. But there are so many different ways of also being involved in this kind of work in different forms, through like unofficial grassroots mutual aid work. So I have many suggestions, and there's also a really particularly great group in Gowanus that I might direct you to if you want to talk further. But thank you for that question or that interest as well.
Sorry, I just also realized that before that I wanted to make sure we shout out that this phase of the project is in Manhattan, but that there will be iterations in each of the five boroughs over the course of the next year. So it's also nice that this is a longer term project. But I just wanted to make sure that that made it into the conversation at some point as like the plug for the project as a whole.
Yes, thank you. I mean, it's complex. It's a complicated work, and sometimes I also realize I forget to say that too. So it will be going to Brooklyn. I'm not allowed to say where yet because we're still finishing up all of those like legal approvals. But it will be in a prominent place in Brooklyn starting in March. Then it will continue to travel borough by borough. And a really important part of this work is that I keep holding log writing sessions and integrate new and different responses. And maybe the most meaningful part of all of this has been people coming to see what they've contributed and experience it in the city itself. The opening was very, very special in that way. And yeah. Were there other questions?
Yes, thank you for that question, Neen, and sorry for mispronouncing your name. The next question comes from Chloe. I'll give Chloe a chance to unmute.
Thank you so much, Alex and Gabby, for this conversation. It's been such a pleasure to listen to. I am curious if you are planning, I know it's like there's all this work that has gone already into public address, and so this feels like a selfish question, but I'm curious if you have ever thought about making a publication to go with this project. It feels so related to, just with the logs and the writing there, but also with the history of language as it relates to the experience of homelessness and the way language and uses of language matter so much in that context and in policy. And I'm curious how you've thought about that.
Great question. And I will make a publication with the Storefront for Art and Architecture. I would like to actually make a logbook. I want to further kind of copy that aesthetic of that cover, that like, kind of iconic record cover. It's very recognizable to people who have navigated shelter, worked in shelters. And I think it's important for because hundreds of people have participated in this work. I think it's very important that there be a kind of archive that's physical, but also potentially for there to be a kind of archive that is digital as well, that lives in a more accessible form. So, in addition to the work kind of just traveling across the city, there's also a lot of public programming that activates it. So the book will also serve as a archive not only of the responses themselves, but the activations and also um, a kind of roadmap of what it means to kind of navigate and work across all of these different systems in order to produce a work of this nature.
That's so exciting. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question, Chloe. Our last question comes from an anonymous audience member who wants to know how your work on this project has impacted your teaching and vice versa.
Um, I mean, it's really impacted my teaching in many immediate and direct ways. I I was able to develop a class at Pratt as part of the Civic Engagement Fellowship in the Fine Arts Department, where when I learned that I was going to be stepping into this role, like my very first email was to a shelter that's a couple blocks away from the school to be able to forge a relationship and to see if there was interest there. And throughout all of last year, I taught a class that um, involved students collaborating. I actually wonder if one of these, there was a student named Jackson in this class, and there's a Jackson on this call. Somewhat wonder if that's that Jackson. But I was able to forge this relationship between the Auburn family residents and Pratt, where in the first half of the semester, students really learn about kind of the histories of socially engaged art and also socially engaged art in relation to housing and homelessness and housing struggles and political engagement. And then students meet with the site and kind of come up with and propose a project in response to needs that have been articulated. And in one semester, that involved my students making these incredible on-site art workshops with their neighbors, kind of borrowing and materials from the school and bringing them to the site to be able to produce workshops in cyanotype, collage, color mixing, and I mentioned a while ago at the very top of this call, like I started working in shelters because I started teaching art in shelters. And for frame of reference, the program that I did that with doesn't exist anymore. Its funding was cut. So there are very few arts programming inside shelters. And though it was temporary, though it was one semester, my students learned about what it was like to actually kind of fill that gap. And we also talked about, what it means to then only have this exist in the course of one semester and how to kind of create sustainable different forms of engaging as well. So that's one way that it has impacted my teaching. I mean, there are many more ways. I think for me, being a teacher in a college setting is just as important and gratifying and meaningful as working in a K through 12 setting, as working in a shelter, as working in formal academic structures, and equally as important to then kind of reroute your power and access and work in informal kinds of ways. A lot of the work, I didn't mention this, but a lot of what I would do in addition to leading kind of log writing classes in shelters is also creates art programming in shelters through a partnership with Materials for the Arts. So for me, and a very like being an educator is so tied up with my work as an artist, and these sides of myself are always learning from each other.
Thank you so much for that answer, Alex. And that concludes our Q&A. We are going to close out with a reading, so I'll hand you back the mic, Alex, to introduce it.
Okay, so in thinking about what I wanted to read for today, I wanted to pick something that was motivating, but also maybe captures the hope that we are all feeling, or that I hope many of us are feeling. So it comes from a book that I really recommend you read in full. I'm just going to read a quick excerpt from the introduction and the conclusion. It's called In Defense of Housing, and it's a book by an urban planner, Peter Marcuse, and sociologist David Madden. And it really is one that helps kind of trace this kind of defense of housing, this kind of defense of housing, but contextualizes it in a way that is really a kind of defense of the home. And with that, I will dig in. In defense of housing. We do not seek to defend the housing system as it currently stands, which is in many ways indefensible. What needs defending is the use of housing as home, not as real estate. We are interested in the defense of housing as a resource that should be available to all. Housing means many things to different groups. It is home for its residents and the site of social reproduction. It is the largest economic burden for many, and for others a source of wealth, status, profit, or control. It means work for those who construct, manage, and maintain it. It's speculative profit for those buying and selling it, and income for those financing it. It is a source of tax revenue and a subject of tax expenditures for the state, and a key component of the structure and functioning of cities. Our concern is squarely with those who reside in and use housing, the people for whom home provides use values rather than exchange value. From the perspective of those who inhabit it, housing unlocks a whole range of social, cultural, and political goods. It is a universal necessity of life, in some ways an extension of the human body. Without it, participation in most of the social, political, and economic life is impossible. Housing is more than shelter. It can provide personal safety and ontological security. While the domestic environment can be the site of oppression and injustice, it also has the potential to serve as a confirmation of one's agency, cultural identity, individuality, and creative powers. The built form of housing has always been seen as a tangible visual reflection of the organization of society. It reveals the existing class structure and power relationships, but it also has long been a vehicle for imagining alternative social orders. Every emancipatory movement must deal with the housing question in one form or another. This capacity to spur the political imagination is part of housing's social value as well. And then they go on to talk about this argument for a radical right to housing. Is housing for everyone a hopelessly utopian goal? Is it plausible to imagine universal and unconditional housing in social and environmental sustainable communities as a matter of right, then our commodification of privilege? As an abstract ideal, housing for all is surprisingly common. New York State has its own distinctive constitutional approach to housing rights. New York's Constitution declares that, quote, the aid, care, and support of the needy are public concerns and shall be provided by the state. Callahan v. Carey, that's what the right to shelter is, a 1979 lawsuit filed on behalf of 6 homeless men living on the Bowery, put this line to the test. Callahan ended in a consent decree establishing a legally enforceable constitutional right to shelter. They go on to say, if a right to housing means anything, it must be the name of a movement to democratize, decommodify, and disalienate the housing system. The right to housing names a direction, not a solution. The solution is to struggle to make that right a reality. Addressing residential injustice and inequality will demand state action as well as large-scale popular mobilization, like we're seeing some of today. A real right to housing implies radical social change, but a world where decent housing is provided to all is possible. It requires confronting the housing system without illusions and changing the process that generation after generation produce residential and social crisis. The contemporary world already possesses the technical capacity and material resources to solve the housing problem. The question is whether all who are badly served by the status quo can unite to create a truly humane system, where housing is not real estate, but is instead home. So thank you all so much for engaging today and for your questions, and Gaby for inviting me to be in conversation. I loved hearing from you and your thoughts on the work.
Thank you so much, Alex. That was so beautiful. And thank you, Gabby, for such wonderful facilitation. And thank you, Susan from Storefront for Art and Architecture for their support and preparing for today's event. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art and Tiger Foundation for sponsoring our NSC program and making these daily conversations possible. And for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on the Rail's YouTube channel. The Rail has been free and independent for 25 years. A donation directly supports our writers, staff, and operations. Support our work through the link in the chat. And if you're free, join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Rosalie Goldberg, Shireen Nishat, and Christina Yang on the event of the Performa 2025 Biennial. And as Israel tradition, you can now all unmute and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you all so much again for today.
Thank you.
Bye,
Wonderful.
all.
Gabby,
So
thank you,
much.
Alex.
Love you
Thank you
guys.
so much.
Conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.